Hello and welcome to Law Excellence Hyderabad and Bengaluru. This is the daily news analysis for 19th May 2020. The online live general studies batch for prelims cum mains for 2021 has started. The admissions for the same have started. Please direct your queries to the numbers given below. As usual, our discussion will consist of deep and targeted news analysis. The former consists of the editorial articles and the latter, which is the targeted news analysis, consists of the remaining important articles in the newspaper. So the title for the present article is A Jolt to National Energy Security. The syllabus connection has been listed here. Please have a look. The issue is related to the power tariff policy and the dimension is related to the proposals in the Electricity Act of 2020. So this article is basically seen in the context of the ABA or the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. So ABA has given out a set of reforms. Some of them were related to NBFCs, some of them were related to banks, some of them were related to agricultures, MSMEs and so on. Similarly, some reforms were also envisaged under electricity. So these reforms, whatever has been envisaged under the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, these are basically against the spirit of federalism, is what this article, the writer is basically trying to claim. Before we do that, the writer also talks about why the DISCOMs are not functioning really well at this point of time. So the first thing you have to know is that the DISCOMs do not create electricity by themselves. These DISCOMs are entities which basically purchase the electricity from the generators, right? So if you purchase electricity from somebody, in exchange you are supposed to give money, right? And the money that is being given to the generators is basically of two types as per Electricity Act 2003 or the power purchase agreements that we have. So the money that these DISCOMs give to the generators is of two types. One is the fixed component and the other is the variable component. And the variable component is basically related to the ups and downs of the market forces. Like for example, if the coal prices have increased, then the variable cost is going to be increasing and you have to spend more money, you have to give more money to the generators. That is the variable component. And in addition to this, you have a fixed component which you have to give whether or not there are changes in the market forces. Coal prices बढ़ रहे हैं, कम हो रहे हैं, इससे कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता है. You just have to give this amount of fixed money. So the DISCOMs, what kind of money do they have to give to the generators? How many types of money do they have to give to the generators? One is the fixed component and the other is the variable component. Now, as per the Central Act, as per the Central Electricity Act 2003, the power purchase agreements that have been negotiated, they were negotiated in such a way that this fixed component has become very high. Right, and this fixed component has become very high and this has increased the debt of the DISCOMs. This is one reason why the DISCOMs are not doing well. And the second reason is the push to renewable energy has also caused some kind of trouble to the DISCOMs. How is that the case? So the renewable energy is basically being given a boost, especially after the National Solar Energy Policy, National Wind Energy Policy, National Hybrid Solar Energy Policy. So under the National Solar Mission and all the kinds of renewable machines we are trying to produce about 175 gigawatts of renewable energy. So as per the central government order, these DISCOMs are supposed to purchase each and every unit of the renewable energy that is being produced by the generators. So at this moment, the DISCOMs are basically purchasing a lot of solar power, wind power and so on, which is fine. But if you are purchasing a lot of renewable energy, naturally they are supposed to cut down on their costs of non-renewable energy. Like for example, if NTPC is purchasing solar power, wind power and so on, it is supposed to decrease its electricity consumption, electricity purchasing from the coal power plants, right? But that is also a problem because of the previous Electricity Act 2003 and the power purchasing agreements that have been already been in place, and the fixed costs are still continuing. Even if you decrease the consumption, decrease the buying of electricity from the generators of coal and so on, you are still supposed to pay out the fixed component, right? The fixed component which you were supposed to pay under the power purchase agreement, right? This is also another reason why the DISCOMs are not doing well. The renewable energy push that has been given in the economy has indirectly contributed to the DISCOM debt. This is the second reason why the DISCOMs are not doing well. And thirdly, which is a part of the technological difficulties we have, there is a lot of transmission and distribution problems. There is a lot of losses that happen when the electricity moves from the point of creation to the point of consumption. The transmission losses are sometimes to the tune of 45 to 50%, which is not really good. It is very inefficient. In addition to this, you also have power thefts and so on. So because of all these reasons, the DISCOMs are not doing well. And now whatever rules that are being created by the central government as a part of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan is basically increasing the problems of the DISCOMs, is what this article is trying to tell us. Having understood the reason why the DISCOMs are not doing well, we will move forward and understand how the recent changes that have been envisaged under the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan decrease the autonomy of the state governments in the context of electricity generation, distribution, etc. So what are these controversial provisions under Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan? So firstly, ABA says that the states should go for greater privatization in the distribution of electricity. That is one point. And secondly, the states should increase the renewable power generation. The states should make sure that the DISCOMs purchase more of renewable energy. And like we have seen already, this is going to hurt the DISCOMs because they still have to pay the fixed cost to the power purchase agreements of coal and so on. That is the biggest problem. And secondly, the central government wants to create a set of regulators, a new set of regulators for the electricity department, electricity distribution and generation. And these set of regulators in each state will be selected majorly by the center. So center is going to play a large role in the selection of these regulators. This is another problem which the states are going to face. And the next problem is that the recent reforms under Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan basically say that you have to stop cross pricing, which is to say the following. We'll understand the concept of cross pricing as such. We have the concept of cross subsidization in what? In railways. Because passenger ticket prices cannot be increased, railways basically charge the freight prices at a higher rate so that the losses are going to be covered. Instead of taking extra money from the passengers, because that is anti-populistic, I'll start charging the freight prices, freight movement more. In much the similar manner, electricity pricing also works. Like for example, you cannot impose extra tariffs on the common man in relation to electricity. So what states do in general is that they start charging more from the factories, so that factories will pay more. Just like railways charge more from the freight movement, the electricity department charges more from the factories instead of the Aam Aadmi. But in such a situation also, there is going to be some kind of imbalance, and this is against the industry or the factories as such. This is definitely not good at this point of time, because factories are supposed to function at the lowest cost possible so that they can produce as much goods and services, right? So this is another reform under ABA, but this is also going to create a problem for the states, because if you don't charge the factories more and you cannot charge the common man at all, then it is going to create a problem, because it is going to mount the debt of the DISCOMs. So these are the steps under Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan which have been contested by the writer of this particular article. By the way, these steps which have been given in relation to electricity reforms, these are not new. These are not specific steps which are new and have been given by ABA alone. This is basically a part of the Electricity Act 2020. It is basically a bill in passing, and this bill has these new provisions of greater marketization, greater capitalization of the sector of electricity. So the central government is trying to push these reforms into the states by saying that you have to follow them because they are a part of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. This has also been contested by the writer of this article. This is the gist of this article. Now let's move on to the next article. So the title for the present article is Accountability Can't Be Placed Under Lockdown. The syllabus correction is listed here. Please have a look. The issue is related to COVID-19 pandemic, and the dimension is the improper handling of COVID-19 pandemic. So this article basically talks about the poor manner in which the center has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. and that it could have done much better. Like for example, the way in which the center has handled the migrant workers, or the way in which the center has handled the lockdown restrictions or the announcement of lockdown restrictions and so on. All these things are questionable, is what this article is trying to tell us. So the article basically says that the way in which COVID-19 has been handled by our central government, it reveals a lot about the governance, it reveals a lot about planning and the center-state relations as such, and it also reveals how the central government treats a common citizen. And this article is quite negative about the way in which the central government is doing the same. Like for example, if you look at the way in which the lockdown has been announced, it has been announced just 4 hours before the lockdown was going to be coming in place. So 4 hours of short notice was not sufficient for people to get ready for the lockdown. So without giving prior notice, lockdown was announced, and in addition to this, the states were not consulted before taking this dramatic and sudden move. This is again a problem in handling the COVID-19 pandemic by the central government. In addition to this article also talks about how the central government has ignored certain points raised by the state governments. Like for example, the West Bengal government has asked the central government to look into the COVID issue in March itself. In March itself, the West Bengal government has said, look, COVID-19 is going to be a really big problem. Let us constitute a parliamentary committee to deal with COVID-19. But the central government has not done so. But when COVID cases have started increasing, we have realized the gravity of the situation, and the central government has given announcement of a lockdown on a very short notice. This is another problem in the way in which central government was handling the COVID crisis. The next point was, immediately after COVID-19 lockdown has started, the central government has used National Disaster Management Act. By using this National Disaster Management Act, it is basically saying that NDMA basically allows the central government to override the state governments in certain areas. So by installing National Disaster Management Act, the central government has assumed a lot of powers, has subsumed a lot of powers, and this is against the federal spirit, because in times of crisis you have to go for center-state relations, good federal spirit, so that the center and the states can work as a team to handle the disaster as such. But by invoking National Disaster Management Act to override the powers of the state governments is not nice, is what this article says. The next point is the point related to the guest workers or the migrant workers. For example, the Bengal Chief Minister has wrote to other states to take care of the stranded migrant workers of Bengal in the respective states. And like similarly, other states also started doing nice things in order to handle the issue of migrant workers to an extent. But the center has realized the problem of migrant workers very late. The states have been doing their best in order to handle migrant workers, but the center has realized the problem very late, is what this article says. And this is against Article 21 of the Constitution, because Article 21 gives the fundamental right of life to each and every person, and so each migrant worker has to have a dignity of life, and this has been denied by the way in which the central government has handled this pandemic. This is what this article says. The article next moves on and talks about the Shramik trains that have been launched by the government to make sure that the migrant workers go back to their homes, but this step has come up too late, is what this article feels. And nextly, the states do not have any revenues as such at the moment. Because of lockdown, no industry is functioning, nobody is earning much income as such, so they won't be able to pay the tax revenues, be it direct or indirect. In such a situation, it will not be possible for the state government to handle the COVID pandemic by themselves. So at least at this point of time, the center should realize its problem and start giving out its payments, the due payments it is supposed to give to the state government, it must give, is what this article says. Now I know this article is totally overly criticizing about the central government, but if you want to use certain points of this particular article in your mains examination, you have to moderate the statements. You cannot write very extreme statements either against the central government or any state government as such. You have to write very professionally worded language, right? Now let's move on to the next article. The title connection for the next article is Preparing for a Syndemic. The syllabus connection has been listed here. Please have a look. The issue is the syndemic. The dimension is related to the innovative population health surveillance technologies. So this article basically talks about two things. Firstly, it tells us what a syndemic is and it gives an elaborate explanation about how syndemic works, and then it moves forward to talk about the innovative health surveillance measures that we can take to handle syndemics or the syndemic-like situations. So to start off, what is a syndemic? A syndemic is a situation in which there are two or more epidemic diseases which interact. Okay, so there could be a situation of COVID interacting with malaria, COVID interacting with other bacterial infections. This is going to create a situation in which a person is affected by one or more diseases, and whole country as such is going to be affected by a set of diseases and not just COVID, and that is basically a syndemic like situation. Now what the experts are feeling is that the COVID-19 is not going to go away. In fact, it will never go away, and there will certainly be a second wave of infections in the months to come. This is what the experts are feeling. But the problem is, in the next 2 or 3 months, India is quite prone to diseases like dengue and malaria, because that is the season, right? That is the season in which you have rainfall, there is stagnant water, there is more circulation of mosquitoes, mosquito larvae and so on, because of which the dengue cases and malaria cases are going to rise. Now this if this dengue and malaria cases are going to come in consonance with COVID, it is going to create a situation of syndemic, because a syndemic by definition is a situation in which two big major diseases, two or more bigger major epidemic diseases interact and create a problem. Now some terminology like syndemic, the syndemic like terminology has been introduced by Mr. Merrill Singer in mid 1990s. Mr. Merrill Singer has coined this term called syndemic. And are there examples in history where we had syndemic like situations? Yes, in 1957 we had this pandemic of Asian influenza. Now this Asian influenza pandemic also got merged with the bacterial infections at that point of time, leading to a syndemic like situation. That is one example you have. The second example you have is in relation to HIV in Kenya. In Kenya, if you take the HIV patients that are there, the infectiousness of the malaria in these patients has increased because of lesser immunity. So HIV and malaria went hand in hand at that point of time in Kenya, as pointed out by the research. So that was also a syndemic like situation. So this article basically talks about this dangerous syndemic like situation, and that India is going to have a lot of problem in future times. And in such a situation, what is the way forward? In such a situation, to deal with syndemic like situations, we need to have a systematic method, systematic procedure to handle the situation. Firstly, we have to go for large scale testing. And secondly, in addition to the testing that we are doing, there should be increased innovations in the way in which we have surveillance or we monitor the health of the people. Every time it is not possible to bring them to the hospital or conduct the tests as such, we need to use some real-time innovative tests. Like for example, you can have smart thermometers, right? You can have smart thermometers to constantly monitor the temperatures of people. Also, there is something called a pulse oximeter. A pulse oximeter is a device to decide on the brain oxygen level. This will also help in large testing of the person with a disease. So using these kinds of new devices and new innovations, in addition to the already present diagnostic methods like RT-PCR test and the antibody testing, then India is going to be very forward in terms of the way in which it identifies the problem of syndemic. Okay, once this identification is done, you will be able to monitor it very well through these innovative population health surveillance measures. And in addition to this, you have to move forward and do it in the rural areas as well, because this is the time in which the migrant workers are going back home. There is a mass exodus from the urban areas to the rural areas because of lockdown restrictions and because of because of lack of livelihood opportunities in urban areas. These migrant workers are going back home. In such a situation, there is going to be a rise in the COVID cases, especially in the rural areas. This is being predicted by the article, and in such a situation, you have to use these innovative measures to monitor the health of the people throughout the country, is what this article says. Now let's move on to the next article. So the title for the next article is Unknown Sources Funding Parties. The syllabus connection has been listed here for your benefit. Please have a look. The issue is related to electoral funding and the dimension is the ADR report on political party funding. So this article basically talks about the report given by the Association of Democratic Reforms. Now this Association of Democratic Reforms, commonly known as ADR, regularly gives out certain reports from time to time which basically tell us what is the percentage of funding which the political parties get from unknown sources. That is the most important outcome of this particular report by ADR. ADR is a very important pressure group, so please keep that in mind. So what are the highlights of this article? This article basically says that more than 50%, more than half of the income of the regional parties, about 23 regional parties have been surveyed by this particular report. So more than half of the income of these 23 regional parties whose annual audit was done recently, more than half of the income came from unknown sources in 2018 and 2019. This is as per the report by Association of Democratic Reforms. If you look at the total income declared by these 23 parties, it was to the tune of 885.9 crores, of which 45% came from known sources and the remaining 55% came from the unknown sources. And these unknown sources are basically what? They are basically coming from the electoral bonds, and this is a big problem as pointed out by this particular article, because electoral bonds were supposed to do what? Electoral bonds were supposed to increase the transparency of political funding. They were supposed to leave a trail of funding so that it will be easy to find out if there is some malafide involved. But because of electoral bonds, there is an increase in anonymity, and this is causing a problem. Now this article will probably figure out as an editorial article in times to come, but this article tells us only this. Keep this figure in mind, write it down in your notes. More than 50% of the income of the regional parties is from unknown sources as pointed out by the ADR report. This is the learning from our article. Now let's move forward. The title for the next article of our discussion is Are the United States and China Entering a New Cold War? The syllabus connection has been listed here for your benefit. Please have a look. The issue is US-China and the dimension is the new Cold War situations between US and China. Before we jump into the article, we will have a brief background about what this Cold War is. Cold War was basically a period of time, probably and possibly between 1945 and 1991. And what happened in 1991? In 1991, the USSR collapsed, and in 1945, we had the end of the World War. So between 1945 and 1991, Cold War was a period which basically saw tensions between the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc. The communist bloc was headed by USSR and the capitalist bloc was led by US and then by Europe and so on. So it was a period of geopolitical tension. Right? It was a period of geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and its satellite states, which are the Eastern European countries, which all of these countries in the East basically represented the communist bloc. What did they consist of? Soviet Union, Eastern European countries and some other countries. And the Western bloc or the capitalist bloc consisted of United States, Western European countries and other NATO allies. So the contest between these two groups is what we call as Cold War. Now, after World War II, the world got divided into two power blocks, namely the communist bloc and the capitalist bloc, as we have pointed out. So these two superpowers, the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc, were primarily engaged in an ideological war, and this ideological war has led to a lot of tension, and this is called as Cold War. And the reason why we call this as a Cold War is because there was no large scale fighting as such directly between the two sides. So they used to neutralize each other, they used to fight indirectly, but there was no direct fighting as such like it happened in the World War. So that is why we call it as a Cold War. Now this article basically says that the rising tension between the United States and the China at this point of time basically tells us that there is going to be a revival of Cold War, but between USA and between China. It is not between USA and Russia like it used to be previously. Now it is going to be between USA and China. Now this is because of the recent developments that we have seen. Like for example, Donald Trump has earlier called the coronavirus infection as a Chinese virus. He called it as a Chinese virus on a particular on a public platform, and he has threatened to seek compensation from China for the damages it has caused across the world. Now, the experts' view in relation to this particular issue is related to the following. This situation is unlikely to ease until the US presidential election, because when you have a presidential election, you need to have a mandate. When you go to the people, you have to ask for a vote, and in order to ask for a vote, you have to basically unite them. And Donald Trump is basically trying to unite the people in the United States by showing the presence of a threat in the form of China. He is showing an enemy, and showing this enemy is trying to unite people on a single thread against China so that he can win the elections. That is one way to do it. And the second reason he is doing it is because he wants to divert the attention of the people. Like, for example, United States has utterly failed in the way in which it was handling the COVID-19 pandemic. There were so many deaths, there are so many infections. In fact, you have the most number of infections in the United States. In such a poor situation, the people are going to question the leader. Yes, why have you not been able to take care of us? We have basically voted for you so that you're going to protect us, right? But you have not been able to protect us. So in order to prevent this kind of questioning from coming up in the public platform, he is trying to divert the issue. Look, I am not the problem. I, Donald Trump, am not the problem. The problem was caused by this Chinese virus. China is the basic culprit here, and I tried my best to handle this situation. So this is the kind of narrative he is trying to build up in his particular campaign. Now, what is the situation in China? The situation in China is that the leadership in China, as well as the public opinion in China, is totally against the United States. They are all united. The people in China are united on a single platform by saying that they are against what Trump is trying to tell us. They're saying that this virus is basically an accident. We have not caused it deliberately. So they are also against USA. So basically USA is against China, and China is basically against USA. So this creates some kind of foundation for a Cold War. That is one reason why the experts are saying that there is going to a resumption of the Cold War like situation. But in this particular case, the prime elements are basically China and USA, as opposed to the previous situation in which the prime elements were USA and Russia. Okay, so this is what this article says. Now let's move on to the next article. The title for the present article is Stimulus to Cost Only About 1% of the GDP. The syllabus connection has been listed here. Please have a look. The issue is Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, and the dimension is related to the various expert views on the stimulus package. Now, in order to handle the corona situation in the sense the economic situation that has arisen because of the lockdown, the health situation that has arisen because of the health pandemic, and the social situation that has arisen because of the mass exodus of migrants to the rural areas. In order to handle all these situations, the government has come up with a reforms package, and this reforms package is basically called as the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. And the government has said, as in Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said, that it is a 20 lakh crore economic package. And the size of this economic package is almost as high as 10% of the GDP is what the government has claimed. Now, several people, different organizations have analyzed this reforms package. They have looked into the several provisions that are specifically there under each of the reforms package. Like, for example, reforms package came up in 4 to 5 tranches, like as in 4 to 5 subcomponents. First subcomponent, second subcomponent, third subcomponent, and so on. This is how the reforms package has come up. Now, each of the subcomponents and their various provisions have been analyzed by the organizations that are there, by different consultancies that are there, and they have said what the government is claiming is not totally correct. The government is claiming that the size of the reforms package is as high as 10% of the GDP, but this is only an estimate. What is actually costing the government is only about 1 to 2% of the GDP, and the government is not giving any extra budgetary support. Like, for example, it is not borrowing money from the market, right? It is not raising any debt from the market. It is not raising any debt from the external market either. It is not taking money from the IMF. It is not asking money from the RBI to print currency. So whatever is being done by the government, it is basically in the nature of regulation. Like, for example, if the government says that it is going to infuse some amount of money into the banks, into the MSMEs and so on. It basically means that some of the money is going to be given by the state governments as well. Okay, and it is only basically a promise. The actual money that is going to be given out is going to be much later, and this does not bode well with the present economic situation, is what this article is trying to tell us. In addition to this, what the experts are feeling is that government is basically cashing the opportunity. This difficult situation is being cashed by the government to drive politically sensitive reforms. Like for example, in normal situations there are certain reforms which you definitely cannot pass because the people are going to oppose, because the state governments are going to oppose, because the trade unions are going to oppose. Like for example, at the moment the state governments are basically coming up with amendments in labor laws which are diluting the labor laws. Will it be possible in a normal situation? No, right? Similarly, if the central government is trying to bring in reforms in electricity, like for example, we've seen the first article which talked about electricity reforms, it is trying to encroach upon the areas of the state. Is it possible in a normal situation? No, right? So these politically sensitive reforms are basically steamrolled. They are being pushed forward in this corona-like situation under the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, and this is not good for the country as such, is what this article is trying to tell us. After criticizing the government for the way in which it is handling this COVID pandemic, the economic reforms package has been criticized. This article also talks about some positive aspects of this economic reforms package. Like for example, Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan does not include extensive outlays to different sectors of the economy, but it comes up with good reforms, and these reforms, if totally implemented throughout the country, it is going to increase the medium and the long term growth. So these reforms are going to help the country in the long run. But if you want to move from the medium term to the long term, you first have to go through the short term, right? And to handle the short term situation, people need money in their hands. People need food in their hands. Agriculture has to be rejuvenated. MSMEs have to be rejuvenated. And this has not been done by the government. So the government is basically giving reforms which focus on medium and long term, so it should also focus on the short term, is what this article is trying to imply. This is the gist of the article. Now let's move on to the next article. So the title for the last article of our discussion is Rare Palm from Andamans Gets a Second Home. The syllabus connection has been listed here. Please have a look. The issue is related to biodiversity in Andaman Islands. The dimension is Rare Palm Pinanga andamanensis. So topics like these, which talk about a rare palm species or critically endangered or vulnerable species, these are especially important for your prelims examination. So firstly, we will look at some background which is related to this particular plant, which is known as Pinanga andamanensis. So the first point is, it is a critically endangered species and it is one of the least known endemic palms of Andaman Island. So where do you find this particular Pinanga andamanensis? You find it in Andaman Islands. So if there is a prelims question which talks about this particular plant, you just by looking at the name of the plant, you can identify the place in which it basically thrives. So that is one cue that you have. And next, it basically occurs in Mount Harriet National Park, which is basically an evergreen forest. So here are two things that you are basically learning from this particular point. Firstly, Mount Harriet National Park, where do you find it? If you find this in your prelims question, you have to identify Andaman. And the kind of forest you have in that particular place is what kind of forest? It is evergreen forest. In fact, if you look at tropical evergreen kind of forest, there are only 3 areas in the country, in India, where you find these kinds of forests. You find them in the western slopes of the Western Ghats, as in the western part of the Western Ghats, and you also find them in the northeast region, and then you also find them in Andaman. So these are the 3 major areas where you will be able to find the tropical evergreen forest, because in order to thrive, tropical evergreen forests require a rainfall of about 250 centimeters. These are the only areas in which you can have this kind of rainfall. Anyway, so these are the points about this particular plant, which is named as Pinanga andamanensis. So this is basically a rare plant. The highlight of the article is basically the following. It is a rare plant which is usually found in the South Andaman Island. We have been trying to conserve this rare palm for quite some time. Initially, some effort was put in to basically plant this and conserve it, but then it was basically disturbed by wild elephants, because wild elephants ate up all the specimens. So whatever specimens were planted in the forest, all of them were eaten up by the wild elephants, so that caused a problem. So now they are basically planted again, and they have found a new home in a place called Palod. Okay, in a place called Palod, a new home has been found for these rare palm of Pinanga andamanensis. That is what this article is trying to tell us. Now let's look at some prelims questions. So let us look at the MCQs here. Recently, Association of Democratic Reforms ADR gave a report regarding electoral funding. It informed that 45% of the total funds are from electoral bonds. In this context, consider the following statements about electoral bonds. So the first statement is only regional parties can raise funds through electoral bonds. This is definitely wrong. Even national parties can raise funds. So for option 1 is wrong. So this and this is wrong. I have to choose between option B and C. Now let's look at option 2 here. Interest rate on this bond is linked to the repo rate. No, this is also not right. Next, it is a form of anonymous donation. Yes, it is a form of anonymous donation. So the answer is C only. Now let's move on to the next question. Mount Harriet National Park, which is in use recently, has which type of vegetation? We just talked about it. It is basically evergreen type of vegetation. So the answer is option A. But usually the more relevant question would be, where do you find Mount Harriet National Park? And your answer is Andaman and Nicobar. So this completes the discussion for our day. Thank you for your participation. We'll meet again.